Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we are discussing the history of photography, but we are beginning at a very specific time, 1888, and we are going to go only to about the 1930s. So our history will be more like a window than it is expansive. 1888 saw the invention of a very important technology called the Kodak hand camera. This was revolutionary because it allowed many people to take photographs simply. It took to some the artistry, and artistry is often just complexity, out of the process of taking photographs. Photography is a mimetic art. And for those of you who don't know what mimetic means, it is essentially an art of imitation. It is an attempt to capture reality. And photography does so simply, instantaneously, and seemingly without human intervention. This was what caused so much anxiety about photography. It is that photography caught reality without human intervention. And I come to this topic now because I have seen so much discussion of artificial intelligence and its rise as an artist. Namely, it is capable of creating images. These images are not mimetic at all. I think that's what's so intriguing about them. And they also create, for the most part, without human intervention. They're causing an anxiety now about what art is and what art will be in the future, much in the way that this Kodak hand camera created that anxiety in the late 1800s. I don't know what we can think about when we encounter AI art now. But we'll link back to it at the end of the video once we see how artists in this time period dealt with this reality, that a new form of visual creation existed, which required, again, no human intervention. It was essentially the eye of the machine. And Walter Benjamin spoke about this. Sorry, I take really hectic notes. The eye of the machine versus the eye of man. So let me now erase all this. Okay. Because this is the crux of the anxiety that created this new art form considered fine art, photography. It all emerged from the issue of this hand camera, which became or created the eye of the machine, which was now in the hands of at least 1 million people, right, in the United States alone. And the Kodak hand camera, this is how it worked. It was like a little box, a little box, much like the cameras we would see, you know, you would grow up with if you grew up like in the 90s or the 80s. Like a disposable film camera almost. And it would come to you with 100 exposures of film. And you would take your exposures, and it was a rather simple process. And then after you would take your exposures, you would send it back to the company. They would develop your exposures, and they would send back the camera with all of the images and a new roll of 100 exposures. So essentially it turned the United States into a bunch of amateur photographers who were going about capturing reality in these images. And because it was so proliferated and everyone could do it, the question of fine art, which functions on exclusivity and functions on complexity of process. It was believed that photography could not enter into the realm of fine art. So the reaction to this mimetic quality of art, this eye of the machine taking over, was to create a human intervention in the photographic process. So essentially, we would not let the machine do all the work. We must add a human intervention into the photography process. And that that human intervention took the form of pictorialism. And so we'll look at pictorialism particularly, but also photogravure is another form of intervention, photogravure, that helped add human intervention into an artistic process that they felt was too machine, too inhuman. It was capturing human life, but without human intervention. And then pictorialism evolved into something that was much more about perspective rather than artistry. So we'll watch that change. So I want to begin now. After you've seen this is what's happened, you have the invention of the Kodak hand camera. Everybody can be involved in the artistic process that is photography. And yet, it is almost like humans are serving the technology and the technology is not serving the human, because humans are essentially creating logs of experience, but they're not the ones doing it. There is so much attention paid on the camera. The machine is doing the work. And so, in a way, it is not the human eye, but the machine eye. And we see that now with AI, as AI is doing so much work with human life. But it's not really the human that's doing the work. We are the supply, all right? This thing is the artist. We have given up, in a lot of ways, our agency and our sight, which is the seat of our anxiety. And this was the same with the invention of the camera. This begs a question, and it's a question that will guide our discussion today, which is, if I can find it, I've written it down in my notebook here, which is all my notes. And it's a question that I've written down somewhere. But luckily I remember it if I can't find it. There it is in big words. This is the question that this anxiety caused. And it's a question that hasn't gone away. Every time we create a new technology that uses human behavior as its source, oftentimes the thing analyzing it is machine now. It is not people analyzing people, but machine analyzing people. A human creation analyzing people. So the question that will guide us today, and I'll leave it on the whiteboard so we can return to it and we won't forget it when I transition to my notes, is, does technology serve the operator? That's my cat trying to get in the room. Or the operator the technology? This question is a form of chiasmus. Chiasmus is when you have a cross in a line of poetry. And so this isn't poetry, but I use this term with narrative in the same. And essentially they are logical questions we can ask by reversing the order of a list. So you have technology listed here, and operator listed second. On the other side of the comma, you have operator listed first and technology listed second. And so many powerful rhetorical, theoretical, philosophical questions are asked through this chiasmus. Does technology serve the operator, or the operator the technology? This was the question. Are we serving the camera, or is the camera serving us? And it is the same for AI now. Are we serving AI, or is AI serving us? And when does the switch occur? In this way, the arrival of the Kodak hand camera in 1888, there was simple, seemingly irrelevant, often not talked about invention, is a precursor to AI and the way that it serves us, and the way that AI acts as an eye, right? Because AI is an eye. It sees, it sifts, and it collects, and then it thinks about. But AI is intriguing because it lacks the mimetic. And perhaps I'll do a video focusing solely on art in artificial intelligence. But for now, we'll focus back on 1888 as that precursor. So this is the question that will guide us as we talk about this movement that emerged out of the Kodak hand camera. We now transition to Alfred Stieglitz, an American photographer who is credited with turning photography into a fine art. This book, Camera Work, is a compilation of photographs from the publication Camera Work by Stieglitz. This publication was printed solely in photogravure, a form of printing that resembled a stamp. Essentially, you would etch the photograph onto copper using light, and then it would be inked and stamped on a piece of paper or pressed on a piece of paper. And this was a form of publishing photographs, printing photographs that felt like it maintained the human craftsman process in art. It maintained something of the hands and something of a trade in it. And so that form of printing is what is in this book. So this would be a photogravure print. You'll see where some of them are. Yes, this is a photogravure print. So it would be on copper, and then ink would be applied to the copper, and the copper would be pressed down. And this was the way that they essentially printed these photographs in order to make them appear or maintain the aspects of drawings, of charcoal etchings. This is not a photogravure, but this one is. And so there's a very different kind of dreamy nature to these photographs that ones that were developed ordinarily would not have through that chemical process. And so photogravure, I'll speak about briefly. Let me go to where I've written about it. Was made by this man, Joseph Niepce. I don't know how to pronounce it, but he succeeded in making the first image exclusively with light. And he discovered this by looking at asphalt and how it hardened when exposed to light. And so 13 years after photography was invented in 1825, he created the first image solely with light. And this is the photogravure process that Stieglitz in 1903 and beyond would use in the publication of Camera Work. And so from asphalt to art is essentially the through line there. And this process could give the photograph the characteristic of an etching or a charcoal drawing. But when we speak of human intervention, this was a form of it. It is an art. And there are artists who still now work in the photogravure. And one artist spoke about this. And he said that it turned the process of photography into more than just surface. And this is the issue with photography as well, is that it's so flat. It's so bare, so spare. It lacks that complexity, is solely a surface. So this photogravure adds that level of artistic quality to it, but it's also mimicking the world of the painting that preceded it. So in a way, it's not visionary, but rather nostalgic. So it's a bit of a nostalgic practice, the photogravure. And also the pictorial is also nostalgic. Now, the pictorial. The Pictorialists believed in creating a new, purely photographic reality. And so they wanted to look at real reality and alter the image. And they would do so through a variety of mechanisms, like they would spread Vaseline on their camera lens, or they would apply chemicals to the film in order to give it a look of a brush stroke. They would what else? They would scratch the film and so on in order to create a picture that was reality but not reality. And this is interesting because I do believe that art is always an imagining some way of another world. It's a complicated relationship between mimesis and newness or imagination. And there are essays written about this, maybe one day we'll look at, but not today. But that mimesis, this complicated recording of reality, involves another step, which is you record reality and then you find the possibility in that reality in the form of art. And that this artistic process must happen first before that possibility is then enacted. What this makes this so frightening about AI is that AI is in a way predicting what will come in its art. And so we can read the future, I think, in AI art. Can we read the future in AI art if we see art as predictive and as essentially the taking of what we would call reality and amending it? Do those amendments then manifest is the question. And so often I find that they do. You go back into the past and you find an image, you find an artistic venture, and you see how that has really borne itself true today. And the art that AI creates is nightmarish. It is a nightmarish art, and it is so interesting to me that a system capable of accessing all human, or such a significant portion of human creations, would determine and create something that is nightmarish, in which people do not even have faces, they do not even really have eyes. And what is that predicting? We have to ask, what is that predicting? Because the AI is going to create a world, is it not? So it feels as if we are serving AI in its own imagination. We are serving AI for its imagination, which will create a world. And currently, if we were to analyze the art of AI, what would we see is a nightmare. And so often in art history, the purpose of art history is exactly this, which is to imagine history, analyze history. How does art relate to culture? I would argue that we ought to look at it differently and think about how art influences the future, particularly as new artistic ventures appear. And if we look at the pictorialist nostalgic impulse, we might understand why they were so frightened and so determined to hang on to a past that was in very much already leaving. By 1915, Paul Strand would arrive and essentially upend the pictorialist movement with his approach to photography, in which he looked at geometric shapes. And he changed the way we thought about art by looking at photography was about the perspective of the photographer and about the framing of the image. It was not about the process of creating the image. And we'll get into that. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm sorry, it's all a bit messy. But anyway, the world that AI imagines is a nightmare. And will that world come to fruition, or will the art become more and more realistic and resemble our world now? I don't know, and it's a question we have to think about. Now, the world that people dream or create, especially those pictorial artists, is not a nightmare. And in fact, it far more resembles a dream. And so we will transition to that book, Camera Work. And so we can see that dream. The world that people imagine is a dream. The world that AI imagines is a nightmare, even when it attempts to create something beautiful. Camera Work was published from 1903 to 1917. It was the arrival of Paul Strand, and I'll write his name here, that really ended camera work as we know it. So we'll begin with, 1915. So only 2 more issues would run after Paul Strand, and they would publish Paul Strand's photographs. This is the pictures of the initial publication. They were beautifully published because of the photogravure. So here we have a photogravure print of Dorothy by Gertrude Casprier. This was printed in 1903. It was in the initial volume of Camera Work, one of the first pictures. Camera Work would put photography as a fine art on the international stage. And actually, Alfred Stieglitz, I believe he lived from, let's look, 1864 to 1946. He essentially founded what is called photo secession, a progressive movement exploring the possibilities of photography in reaction to the creation or the ubiquity of photography in the 20th century. But his epitaph read as this, which is a fascinating epitaph, if I can find it. His epitaph read this: "If only England had a Stieglitz, but Stieglitzes are rare. It suffices that one Stieglitz has been born in our generation, and our debt to him is enormous. He is not only, as those who know his work have long been persuaded, the greatest living photographer, he has been, and solely for the love of it, the greatest propagandist for photography." When he published Camera Work, his interest was not in his own photography at that point. He really shifted his focus towards the popularization and the elevation of other photographers. Many of them women, as you'll see. This is Gertrude Casprier, The Manger, again 1903, Camera Work 1. So these were female photographers that have, for the most part, been forgotten in our contemporary mind. This book is filled with women taking pictures. Here's Alfred Stieglitz's photograph, one he took, a photograph here as well. This is in the issue 12 of Camera Work, of a young girl. And what fascinates me about this photograph is the juxtaposition of this rather innocent girl with the eyes looking out. That is what's perhaps most fascinating to me about photography, is the ability to capture the eyes frozen in one moment and all the emotion that is communicated in this. To speak of emotion, this photograph is highly subjective, and photographs, for the most part, were objective given their highly mimetic nature. And so the pictorialists, with their manipulation, and you can see how this resembles brushstrokes, this would have been manipulation to the film itself. This kind of outer color or outer texture. This texture is very much like a sepia-toned filter that you could put on, but that's all resembling really the photogravure process in the early 1900s, late 1800s. But this is intended to communicate emotion. It's not just a bare reflection of time. It is rather an emotive thing. So perhaps what we ask of art, if we were to define art, what separates art from pure recording or journalism, we say, is the emotion. That emotion is the key to art. It should communicate the subjective emoting of a singular moment, I would say. This is what it would do. This is what AI cannot do. I think AI really struggles with that, and it creates emotions that are for the most part negative. And I speak to this because it seems that negative emotions are almost easier to create than the multifaceted, paradoxical, complex emotions that something like this would communicate. And you look primarily, again, I mentioned it but forgot, the young girl holding in her hand a notebook, and behind her a woman holding a knife. And so you have the innocence here, and then a woman who looks like some sort of cook, suspended in air beside her neck, holding a knife. And all of this has a very nostalgic aspect to it, a dreaminess that pictorialists like to create, because again, they wish to create a new world through photography, not to simply record our own. To see her in real life would not look anything like the picture that we see. And so this is a fascinating thing, innocence of a young girl against the woman with the knife. Camera Work 12, 1905. And to look at this one now, the dreaminess of the veil over her. This one, as you can see, is far more manipulative. There's almost nothing in focus. I imagine this would have had the Vaseline smeared on the lens or something like that, and chemicals added to it. I'm just going to move this a little bit. There we go. Chemicals added to it to create these smudges, these differences here. It gives it a look of age, but it also imagines a dream, a kind of thing that exists outside of time and communicates to me the beauty of the moment in which you hold a child. And this one, the framing is extraordinary. This is another Gertrude Caspier. Blessed art thou among women, 1903, the image of the mother over the boy. Okay, we come now to a Stieglitz photograph. Stieglitz began taking pictures of cityscapes, which was a divergence from what one ordinarily took pictures of, especially in the pictorialist movement. What was ordinarily photographed were these highly rolling, soft landscapes, nostalgic images. They were not like this, right? This is Midst Steam and Smoke, 1904, more industrial scenes. They were really more about landscapes on the lake, as you can see, to resemble the old paintings. Nothing like what Stieglitz would take pictures of, which was the forms that existed in the city. This would predict Paul Strand, whose work would focus entirely on shapes and the manipulation of shapes by the use of framing and perspective. So here you have the tree, and the oblique lines, I think, are very important, the way that the lines go to the side. Particularly here, these are rather straight, but in photography, something emerged, and I'll read about it very quickly here, called which is the introduction of extreme angles. And these extreme angles were to tilt the ground, to essentially change the perspective. So ordinarily you take a picture and you keep the ground straight. If you tilt it just a bit, you would revolutionize, according to this, the paradigm of the vertical wall. So you would change the vertical. And so the incline makes a wall experienceable. Essentially, your photograph, when its perspective is tilted, becomes an experience, and the slope implies movement and effort. It means that the body cannot abstract itself from the space. So essentially, that incline would enter the person into the photograph. And so I believe I have a photograph that shows that kind of oblique nature. I hope it's in here. It might not be. Did I keep it? It might be somewhere else. No. Yes, this is one. And this is a Paul Strand. So you see, he takes the ground. This ought to be, right, a bit like the horizon, the ground. But he has changed the perspective in an oblique line so that we feel drawn into the photograph, and there's that sense of movement. So much of that is happening with these geometric shapes, which Paul Strand realized the camera could capture in a very different way than a painting ever could. So essentially, rather than creating photographs that were mimicking painting, he was creating photographs that utilized for artistic purpose the unique values of the camera. And so these dark, very defined geometric shapes are what make this this photograph so overwhelming to look at. And these oblique shapes, combined with the shadows, which through the photograph viewer makes the shadows so closely resemble in color the black empty windows or gateways. I don't know what they are. 1916 this is. So this is a photograph that is made into art, not by process necessarily, or art changes made to the film, because there is no change made to the film here. This is highly mimetic. Exactly what happened is recorded. You'll notice there's no strange brushstrokes damage done to the film as there is on this cat. There's just the line, and the line is what turns this into something experienceable. It's what makes it real. It's what turns it into another world in the way that this attempted. And so our image of the city is so much defined by those who record it. And Paul Strand is one of the most visionary recorders of the city with photography. And again, here's another Paul Strand who's done the same thing with oblique angles. Rather than focusing on the straight telephone pole, as we have here, if we go back to Stieglitz, sorry, he focuses very much, where is it? The straight telephone pole. You'll notice this is perfectly framed, exactly how one looks at things, ideally in a painting. But we rarely look at things along a horizon. We're always searching in different ways and looking at different vantages. And so he's taken the photograph to emphasize the caterwauling of this telephone pole. And it is emphasized also with the caterwauling of this telephone pole. And he's chosen to keep this straight, the horizon line, because there's no need to invert it due to the diagonal of this telephone pole there. So that's interesting. Now Paul Strand here is again giving us a foreground that's tilted, right? It's tilted. This is the horizon line going back, and it's tilted just so to emphasize the careening nature, the crowds of this 1916 New York street. Again, emphasis on oblong shadows. No shadows in this photograph, you'll notice, which is interesting. You then have Radcliffe Dugmore, A Study in Natural History, 1903. And so again, these are precursors to Strand. Stieglitz is the one who becomes closest to Strand, I think. This one reminds me the pool of a morning walk in Georgia. I would go on many morning walks in Georgia when I had a baby, and I would take her in the carriage or the stroller every morning, and there would be swamps like this. And this is a pool, and so pools are not like swamps. Pools are temporary, and there was a pool in Georgia that was temporary and would fill up with little peepers in February, so right about now. And as I'm in Connecticut going through a massive storm, I do miss the February warmth in Georgia and the waking up of things. So this is fascinating because this must have been done from some manipulation to the film, just by looking at how much like a person this resembles. And so this is photography, and yet it is so obviously in the realm of fiction. You have this outlined silhouette here, and a man, almost like the face of God, behind him. So this is clearly manipulated. The earliest of photographic editing. Dawn flowers. These predate or remind me of the ectoplasm photographs, which I'm going to do a video on eventually, which were photographs that people began to take actually at this time, thinking that they could capture spiritual activity in photograph. And so perhaps I'll do that video next rather than the Klug, I don't know. But this does remind me of a bit of a seance taken in 1903, a photogravure, and this an artist, rather severe, the self-portrait. If it's a self-portrait, I wonder if it's him. And it's interesting, if it is, that he's pictured with a paintbrush, that it would be a painter transitioning to photography in some way. You'll notice how much, again, this one is so much like the ghost photographs. I kind of want to keep, so sorry, I keep hitting I want to keep this for when I do the ectoplasm video, because it so reminds me of that spiritual. It does remind me of that spiritual photography that emerged out of parlor room games and anxiety about the world wars. Now this is certainly emblematic of the portraits of the 1800s, 1700s. Sargent-like part. It's much like a Sargent painting, isn't it? A Sargent painting, portrait, a famous portraiture, Sargent. But I was going to say, isn't it fascinating again? Steichen, Edward Steichen. So many of these are so overexposed or so altered that they really don't look like anything I've seen. Nude with cat. You can hardly even see the cat. If there is a spirit realm, I am certain this is what it looks like. I'm amazed by these photographs. When I look at these women, like this woman, I just see a woman like I would see today. They're not so changed. She looks like someone I could see on the street. And it's the same with this woman's portrait in the back. Not this. We'll look at these in a second. A Flemish interior. But no. I caught it. Let me see if I can find it. Very quickly. Flip through. There's so many amazing photographs in here. Literally every single one is extraordinary. Look at that one. I want to keep this one too. This is for a book I'm writing. It'd be good to describe. So again, I'll pull that out. On the East River. I love it because of this kind of rakish looking boat here. And then you see the steamboat in the background. I just love ocean scenes. Put that there. Good. But what I was looking for is a woman here, yes. A woman who looks like a woman looks today. You know, I see her and I feel that she's no different really than any of the friends I have in college or when I was in high school. The same expression, the same sort of girl. So, I'm very fond of this picture. Oh, and here's one, if we're going to go deep into the photograph viewer. This is Steichen again, so he's all the way back here. He has a very clear style. I think we could have told this immediately just by... It's hard to believe that this isn't even a photograph. But again, you manipulate to capture the emotion that you feel that photography can't do. Because again, it's like the statement goes, photography is all surface, and you've mucked up the surface to suggest that there's something deep beneath the surface. And that is, I think, why these remind me of the ectoplasm photographs, because that is all about the photography of spirits. It's all about getting beneath the surface of things and seeing past reality for something that exists behind it. And so I'm not surprised that this sort of pictorialist movement was occurring simultaneously or a little bit before the ectoplasm photographs were taken. More Steichen, a picture of Henri Matisse. And so the modernism in Matisse's work also aligned with the pictorialism. So the artistic movements and the photography movements were happening a bit the same. But let's go back now. We'll stop here maybe before we go all the way back. This Guido Rey, The Letter, 1908. Wealth keeps us in the past, doesn't it? The other women who appeared poor, they look as we do now, but these wealthy women look as if they belong to some time other than our own. I guess we progress into the future when we perceive ourselves as imprisoned. If you feel perfectly free, you will do nothing to change your situation. And that is why I think that wealth keeps us in the past to a certain extent. But let's go on now. This is absolutely beautiful over the housetops. All of the steam. I used to love when I lived in a factory, and I didn't live in a factory, but I lived next to one. I was a bit poor, and so I lived in one of those little economically depressed mill towns with all the old factories. And in the winter, it would snow a great deal. 3 or 4 feet would be on the ground, and there would be snow drifts, the size of an entire story of a building. And in the morning, it was so cold that you could look out over the valley and see all of the smoke rising, or the mist, or these clouds rising from the houses, and everything would be white, and then the sky would be filled with these plumes. It was so beautiful. So 1908, over the housetops. I'm so grateful that these exist. And we'll keep going. Baron de Meyer, guitar player of Seville. And she's beautiful. Again, wealth keeps us a bit antiquated. Still lifes. Still lifes are interesting because these are the ones that would most resemble paintings, do you think? And so we could look at a still life in painting compared to this. What one can do with light and reflections in photographs is a bit different. Little lilies in a bowl, and these flowers dying in their vase. Wildflowers. 1908. More still life, the grapes. Pretty fantastic. Let's keep going. More women. Women are so often the subjects of these pictorialist photographs because women so often represent dreams, I think. They are dreamy figures, the women in dreams. But let's keep going. Back here, because I'm fascinated by the just abundance of telephone poles in this kind of work. But these are straight, you see, very straight. Though you do have the oblique line of the river going through. Now we'll just flip through quickly, and if we see anything, we'll stop. This one's a fascinating colour, isn't it? Little girls playing ring toss in 1903. The tilt of the tree here. This is a Stieglitz as well, makes sense. 1903, titled The Street, with the wagons, New York, and the horses. Winter shadows. Evans, cathedrals. Cathedrals, cathedrals. More cathedrals. The whole series. Dreamy cathedrals. You can see how the light spills into them. Photogravure puts so much attention to shadows and light in a way that sees differently than people, I think, because you look into the world and you don't see this anywhere. It's far outside the realm of realism, I think. Nothing looks this way. It brings attention to light in a way that paintings don't. I do like that. I do wonder, when you have a new tool, it changes the way we see things. That's what art shows us. And so to come back to this question, I remember we asked it ages ago. Does technology serve the operator or the operator technology? The fact that the new tool changes the way we see things, it's almost as if the world is begging us to change our perspective every time a new invention arrives. This is fascinating. This does look like a painting made with dots. Moonlight is what it's called. Arthur Beecher and Robert Damaki. That's a beautiful picture. Look at this. I love how confusing it is because you have the hat, but there's no real good focus on her because there's so much going on in the background of it that it's really fascinating. It's kind of hectic to look at. In Brittany, 1904. Wow. Street in Mentoni, I don't know how to say that. Oh, I don't even know where it is. 1904. Severity. What a name for painting. This is severity. The severeness. How severe her look is. Her silhouette. Her nose. The way the light hits. It really is amazing to think that this is a photograph. It does look much more like a painting. This is contrasts. The woman, the marble. Steam and smoke. Nudes, of course. This is one that reminds me of a Paul Strand, because again, it is taking perspective, it's zooming in on something and focusing on lines and geometric shapes. See, it creates that, bordered by that. Shapes you would not ordinarily notice, patterns you would not ordinarily notice. Photography has certainly changed our perspective on things. A breastfeeding child. A study, 1904. A house, just the edge of one. Post wintry weather. Stop at this because this is what it looks like outside. And there's been an ice storm, so all the trees are covered in ice. Again, the focus on the slightly off kilter. But now let's go to the Strand. Strand spelled the end of this movement. We didn't spell the end, it still continued, but for the most part it spelled the end of camera work. This is a gallery of camera work photographs. A photograph viewer was printed and put on the walls. Photo Secession, as the group was called. This is what the galleries look like. This is very much mystical. Mystical over a brass bowl, predicting the future, whatever. Yeah, very much photography of the future, but also of the past. Very rarely of the present. And I think it comes from an anxiety when you have a photograph that you've captured something that's immediately gone. And so it feels unreal to call it the present captured here, because it might as well not exist. It's gone so quickly. But let's go now to the Strand, all the way back. Oh, that's a beautiful picture. Girl with rose. It's her expression in the way the light hits her face. It feels like it's a still from a film, like something very important has just happened. So much emotion and subjectivity in this. And you do question, if it were not manipulated so, would that emotion appear? I'm not sure. I don't think it would. There is the softness of it is so much an essential component of the emotion that is communicated to us. But the Strand, of course, will keep that there. Let's go to the Strand. Ah, the silver cap, some old fashions. The cup. Baron A. de Meyer. Oh, Mama, with her children. See, this is less obscure than the one we just looked at, and I do feel it has less of that emotive quality to it. But it is interesting how only the boy looks at the camera and the women look away. But now let's go to the Strand. Is this a Strand? No, it's a mile. All right. Did I write anything down about Strand? I can't remember. Let's look. So this is what Stieglitz called Strand's photographs. Strand came to Stieglitz. He was very inspired by Stieglitz and showed him his photographs. And what Stieglitz said of them was that they were brutally direct, devoid of any ism, pictorialism. They were separate from any movement. And they were a direct expression of today, that essentially someone had finally found what photography ought to be. And it was that moment that spelled the end of camera work, because pictorialism could no longer be presented in the way that Paul Strand's work needed to be presented. And so here we have, again, photographs that look ordinary to us now. This looks like the scene that I might see if I step out onto outside at work. And you look down, and that's precisely what you would see. They captured the landscape of our lives. He did. And he made it feel as if we were looking at that landscape by changing the perspective and the focus. It's not a godlike omniscience, but rather the view that a small creature would have, much like we have. And so, again, Strand really changed things. Look, a little slip of a street, because we rarely see the whole street. We don't have that vantage. And I love how it's always looking down, because what modern life has told us is that there are levels, and we so often are above everyone else, looking down on things. That's an ordinary experience for us. We don't live on the ground anymore. So he's caught that. Look at more Strand. This is the most depressing photograph I've ever seen. It looks like you're just going down the highway. And so there is a sense of why with these photographs. I'd much rather be lost in something like this when I look at art than something that is trying so desperately to capture now. Sometimes you want the nostalgia. Are there any more Strands? Or is that it? There's got to be more. 1913, after the races, the horse races with their hats. Paul Strand, there we go. So you see a return to focus. This is not soft, but focused on the expressions of the people. Every detail of them. But they're caught in unposed moments. The others feel very posed, the Pictorialists' photographs. These feel unposed. They're just a man glancing off, looking worried. There's a sense of immediacy to them. Gosh, it really does capture the feeling of cities, of being pressed together with so many people. And he doesn't give them names, they're just photograph. This one really gives you an idea of how he was working with shapes. Focus on shapes of disorienting, but also leading one in. You can barely see that there are people there. They're standing in the shadow of some great They're standing in the shadow of some great technological or mechanical structure. You think they aren't. I, for one, thought this was a rather small shadow. And it wasn't until I noticed the people in the corner here that I saw how immense this structure really is. Can you see the people? They're barely there. There they are. Very nice. And the last is the Paul Strand. Wow. Contrast here. So again, Paul Strand took us out of the lack of focus, of obscuring, of smearing Vaseline on lens, and obscuring through different means, through changing the direction of the camera and the frame, obscuring through use of the eye and where it looks rather than clouding the eye. So obscuring through sight rather than clouding. He took photography and changed where he looked. And I think that is so often a statement that I make with every photograph. If you think about the fall of Icarus, you change where you look, you frame it differently, and so many different things arrive. And we look in the same places. So perhaps what we can learn from this is look somewhere different tomorrow when you're walking to work, or you're taking the train, or you're driving, or you're going to school. Look at a different place in the classroom. He's made strangers interesting, hasn't he? By focusing on their face. It's a different way of seeing, and it can bring life to worlds that perhaps feel like they're becoming less and less alive. This one's great. We ought to end on this one chant. These are his Stieglitz photographs of exhibitions. This is Picasso exhibition. Nadelman. And incredible photographs. And there she is, a woman in contemplation. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that little discussion of photographs. And I hope to see you again soon. Thank you, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.